Hello patrons, I'm Rob Caskie, proudly engaging in storytelling, and I hope that you are enjoying this journey with me. Today I want to talk about a remarkable French polar explorer called Jean-Baptiste Charcot, because I think that polar exploration, particularly in the Antarctic, has always been traditionally seen as the preserve of the Norwegians and the Brits, with a few other nationalities thrown in. But one of those who should be best remembered and very fondly remembered is a man called Jean-Baptiste Charcot, who was the product of a very, very well-known French doctor and surgeon, and the father always dreamed that his son would follow in his footsteps in the medical world. Now, Charcot was lucky enough to do two major expeditions to the Antarctic Peninsula, that little thin strip of land that runs up towards South America. The first expedition was 1903 to 1905, and the second was from 1908 to 1910. And Jean-Baptiste, as a young boy, is famously remembered for throwing a wooden box into a swimming pool and running and jumping onto the box, and the box shot out from under him and he fell in the water laughing, and the adults around the pool asked what on earth that was for, and he said, "Pourquoi pas? Why not?" And they said, "What are you referring to?" And he said, "Well, one day I dream of being a polar explorer." Well, this boy was lucky enough to finish school, obviously very bright. He then studied medicine and qualified as a doctor, at which point his father passed away, freeing Jean-Baptiste up to pursue a life in polar exploration, much as Roald Amundsen's circumstances had afforded him the change from medicine into polar exploration. And with his father's passing came a fortune in terms of inheritance. Most of these explorers always had an issue finding enough funding and sponsorship for their expeditions. But despite his wealth, he was obliged to build a small ship called the Francais in a place called Milo. And the financial restraints forced him to install engines that were really too small and too weak for the work required of a ship in the Antarctic. Well, Jean-Baptiste set off with his team down into the Antarctic Peninsula, having initially planned to go into the Arctic. But a Swedish explorer called Otto Nordenskjöld and his team had become marooned and lost in the Antarctic, somewhere on the Weddell Sea side, on the Antarctic continent side of the Antarctic Peninsula, down at the end of the Antarctic Sound. And without batting an eyelid, this remarkable human being decided to set off with his ship and his team into the Antarctic Peninsula to help with the search for Nordenskjöld. Well, it turns out that Nordenskjöld and his men, who were marooned in 3 different locales, all ended up finding one another on the same day in a quite extraordinary tale of intrigue. Not one of the men was lost. It's a wonderful story I'll perhaps share with you on another occasion. But Charcot and his team were lucky enough to explore much of the myriad of islands down in the Antarctic Peninsula. On the western side of the peninsula, the weather is considerably gentler and more temperate than it is on the eastern side of the peninsula, where the weather is dictated by the Weddell Sea and the exposure and the winds that come down, the katabatic winds from the Antarctic continent itself. And Charcot and his men found a little bight, a tiny little harbour that would subsequently be called Port Charcot, where they would moor their boat, the Francais. And cleverly, across the front of this bight or harbour, they placed a large marine chain with the intention of keeping out icebergs and ice that was floating past and prevent damage to the ship, which worked extremely well. They built on shore a wooden hut for magnetic observations. For magnetic observations, you can't really have metal affecting the magnetic readings. They used it as a storeroom, and they enjoyed pretty temperate weather. They did a huge amount of exploring, these intrepid Frenchmen, on foot, of the land masses around them, and indeed even pulling boats down over the ice and the ice floes on the edge of the land down to the south of where the Francais was harboured. It's an extraordinary story. Robert Falcon Scott, that famous British explorer, always called Charcot the great gentleman of polar explorers. He was a man who observed objectively, was an immaculate recorder of what he saw and what they recorded. Mount Francais on Anvers Island at 2,700 meters in height, the highest mountain in the Antarctic Peninsula, is indeed named by Charcot and his team. And those of you who are fortunate enough to go down into the Antarctic Peninsula will be intrigued at the prevalence of French names, all of which stem from the Charcot expedition. And on this expedition, the French had a pig called Bertie. And Bertie was the firm favourite of the team, a wonderful pet. Now, being French, they ate well, they had a good cook with them, they prided themselves of having dessert with every evening meal. They ate penguin and seal supplemented with tinned meat, vegetables, tinned vegetables. And the diet of the French was certainly good, along with champagne. And then they would mix it up a little bit with fresh fish. Now, strangely for me, when the man doing the fishing would catch fish, they just cut off the line with the hook in the fish, put it in a bucket, and they would deal with the hooks in the fish and the fish being prepared for consumption later on. Well, these fish with the hooks intact were in a bucket, and in a moment of a lack of concentration, Bertie found the fish and ate the fish. And when the team realized what had happened, they were horrified. And they implored upon Charcot, the doctor, to do an operation on Bertie to try and remove the fish hooks from his food pipe, or indeed from his stomach. Well, Bertie sadly never recovered from the operation. And of course, many of the men in their records record the death of Bertie in far more melancholic terms than any of the deprivations they suffered as a result of this expedition. And when the winter had passed, these intrepid Frenchmen took off again on the Francais and were indeed confused by a mighty iceberg that was extending 50 feet above the waterline. And assuming that the water between them on the ship and the iceberg was deep, indicated by the presence of the iceberg, they proceeded and they rammed a rock, which did a large amount of damage to the Francais. They had to pump wildly to keep the Francais afloat and make their way to a little port that they had named Port Lockroy on Vinca Island, where there was safe anchorage and effect temporary repairs to the Francais. The Francais would eventually sail back in 1905 all the way back to France, with the team acknowledged as heroes. Well, on account of the success of the Francais expedition and all the new survey work that they'd done down in the Antarctic Peninsula, Charcot was now a hero. And he didn't battle to raise the money and the sponsorship for a second expedition. And indeed, there was a lineup of men wanting to return to Antarctica with him, but most of the original team were initially selected to join him. And of course, a larger ship was built with the expected name of Port-Coipa. Why not? And they moved off down into the Antarctic Peninsula and continued with the remarkable exploration work and geographical survey work that they had begun in 1903 to 1905, moving as far down as almost 70 degrees south into what is called Marguerite Bay, lovely French name. Isn't it tragic to consider that the Port-Coipa also struck a rock? It was stove in. The damage was extensive. And they managed to make their way back to Vinca Island, to Port Lockroy, that safe anchorage. And they had a diver explore with a very special dry suit into which they pump air to go under the waterline and investigate the damage. And he had a private consultation with Charcot and told Charcot that the damage was severe, that any further ice work would certainly sink the ship, and he was strongly recommended to leave Antarctica immediately and head back to South America. Well, Charcot, being Charcot, a bit like the French rugby teams, he kept the news a secret from his team. Hasty repairs were effected to the hull of the Port-Coipa, and he promptly sailed south again, doing further exploration work and survey work. It's a wonderful tale, because eventually they would leave the Antarctic and sail back to Porto Madryn, a lovely harbour town, indeed on the eastern side of Argentina, and make their way back from there all the way back to France. I find it absolutely tragic that this most popular and indeed scientific of explorers, a man very well remembered in France, would indeed die off the coast of Iceland in a mighty storm amongst the waves with which he was so familiar, where his ship was driven onto the rocks and wrecked in a storm, and he drowned at sea. But I hope that you've enjoyed this little account of Jean-Baptiste Charcot, the great gentleman of polar explorers, and a man who's often overlooked when one considers people like Amundsen and Scott and Shackleton, and indeed even the American bird and his aviation adventures down in Antarctica. But spare this man a thought, and if you want to read about one of the great polar explorers, particularly in the Antarctic Peninsula, take a moment and read about Jean-Baptiste Charcot, that good-looking, flamboyant French doctor. I hope you've enjoyed this story. There'll be more to come. Thank you very much indeed.